I think we should start. Okay. So, hello everyone, and welcome to yet another virtual event hosted by AUC Press. With this time, we're co-hosting it with Arabic Literature and Translation blog, founded by Marcia Links-Quayle. She's one of our panelists and moderator today. And welcome for tonight's talk about the English edition of I Do Not Sleep, okay, the novel by the late Egyptian writer Ihsan Abd al-Quddus, who is one of the greatest Egyptian writers of the 20th century. And this novel, the English translation, just came out this month, actually worldwide. You can purchase your copy from the nearest bookstore or online book retailers. I'm Suzanne Inewi, and I'm partner at AUC Press and bookstores. And our event tonight will take around 1 hour or so, and we're going to have a Q&A at the end. So make sure to type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, because if you put it in the chat, we might miss it. And for our viewers on Facebook, you can write in your comments on the Facebook Live, and we're going to put it here for Marcia to ask to our panelists. The event, as I said, is broadcasted live on Facebook, on our page, and will be available after the event on Facebook at the American University in Cairo Press, and also on our YouTube channel. So we're very excited to be hosting tonight's event and talking about this exciting novel. But let me first introduce our panelists for tonight. We have Jonathan Smolin. He is the Jane and Raphael Bernstein Professor in Asian Studies at Dartmouth College in the US. He is the author of Moroccan Noir, Police, Crime, and Politics in Popular Culture, published in 2013. And he's the translator of several works of Arabic fiction, and he is the translation on the English edition of I Do Not Sleep. Then we have Marcia Links-Quayle. She is the founding editor of Arab Lit and Arab Lit Quarterly, and she's the co-host of the Bulak podcast, and her translations of Sonia Nim's time-traveling Thunderbird trilogy and Haya Saleh young adult novel Wild Poppies are forthcoming in 22 and 23 as well. So congratulations on the forthcoming translations. And last but not least, we have Sharif Abd al-Quddus, who is an independent journalist based in Cairo. And for 8 years, he worked as a producer and correspondent for the TV radio news hour Democracy Now! And in 2011, he returned to Egypt to cover the revolution. And since then, he has reported from across the region for a number of print and broadcast outlets. He received an Izzy Award for Outstanding Achievement in Independent Media for his coverage of the Egyptian Revolution, and an Emmy Award for his coverage of Trump's Muslim ban. He is currently an editor and reporter at Bala Masr, and most importantly, he's the grandson of our prolific writer, Ihsan Abd al-Quddus. You could see the similarity in the names, of course. We're gonna move now to Marcia, who's gonna moderate tonight's event. Marcia, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so excited about this. Not only is Ihsan one of the most popular Egyptian novelist of the 20th century, this is just an extremely fun book that I encourage everyone listening to pick up a copy of and read. And so we wanted to start actually with a reading that Sharif will do, but very briefly, Jonathan, if you could kind of give us this context of when the novel began appearing in serialization, how people might have received that because of this, the way it was placed.
Absolutely, thank you. And thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to have the chance to talk about this. Excuse me, what might not be obvious from the novel is that Ihsan was the editor-in-chief of the most popular magazine in Egypt at the time, named Rosa Yusuf. And for at least a decade before this novel was published, writers, in particular women, would write into the magazine asking for his advice, typically about matters of love or marriage or family. And they would begin these letters with "Dear Ihsan," and then they would write their letter and he would write a response typically. And so this is this novel was serialized week in and week out in that magazine, starting in fall of 1955. And this was a form that many readers we're very familiar with, but also many of them accidentally thought that this was real, that this was not fiction, but that this was a real letter to Ihsan that was being serialized. And we know this from the letters that the magazine was publishing, people wanting to meet Nadia and have the opportunity to maybe propose. So this is the kind of immediate context for the novel as a letter.
Excellent. So Sharif, if you would go ahead and read us from the beginning.
Sure, and thanks very much for having me and for putting out this translation. So my grandfather almost always started books with a little quote. This one starts, "I'm both good and evil because I'm human." This is the opening. Dear Ihsan, I'm Nadia Lotfi. You don't know me, even if I did turn your head both times you saw me. Once on Sidi Bishra Beach in Alexandria, and another time at the Semiramis Hotel in Cairo. Each time I didn't pay much attention to you, as I'd gotten used to turning men's heads. I've been writing you this letter or notebook for 3 months. I never meant to write you such a long story, my story. All I meant to ask you was a single question. Does God exist? But I realized it was a ridiculous question. I really do feel the existence of God. Terror fills me whenever I mention him. I even spent years praying 5 times a day, wrapping a white veil around my head, wearing a white shirt that rose up to my neck, with long sleeves hanging down by my sides, whenever I stood praying like an angel being conducted to heaven, to the unknown, to God. Yes, I'm convinced that God exists. So convinced that it made my pen tremble as I wrote those words, doubting his existence, tremble from fear. And here I am, repeating to myself, I take refuge in God the Magnificent. I take refuge in God the Magnificent. Maybe I wanted to ask you, what is God? Yes, what is God? Tell me. God is truth, virtue, and goodness, since the prophets couldn't have called us to worship deception, sin, and evil. He's the powerful one, since the people of the earth couldn't have united to worship a weak God with no power or strength. So why does the powerful truth leave us to practice weak deception? Why does virtue abandon us to sin? Why is evil victorious over goodness in us? Tell me, why? Tell me, what is God then? I was told that God the Almighty created us, that he created our intellect and will so we could distinguish between good and evil, and that he left us in life to put our behavior to the test, like an exam. Whoever passes has paradise, and whoever fails has hell. I was told this. I tried to be convinced, but I wasn't. There can't be a ministry of education in heaven that gives us sheets of questions and then takes the answers to give them to committees for grading. And then suppose that I failed the test, who'd be responsible? My ignorant mind and weak will. And who put this ignorant mind in my head and furnished me with this weak will? Who created me like this? God. God is the one responsible for me failing the test of heaven. How can I be punished for a crime for which I'm not responsible? How can I be burned for sin I didn't commit simply because heaven oppressed me by giving me a limited mind and weak will? No, 1,000 times no. This can't be God. God doesn't need to give people a test because he's known them ever since he created them. He's too merciful to leave them to a fight in which they're torn between good and evil. He's not like the Roman emperors who used to let lions loose on their subjects to be entertained by the sight of the battle between wild animals and men, by the sight of blood spilled in the Colosseum. He's God, the merciful, the compassionate. He's love and peace. There has to be another explanation. There has to be another explanation for good and evil, for heaven and hell, for the scales of judgment in heaven. Or have I become an infidel? I feel my heart pound. I feel as if there's another woman inside me slapping her cheeks, screaming and wailing as if she's throwing me down the well. I repeat again, I take refuge in God the Magnificent. I take refuge in God the Magnificent. God will no doubt forgive me since he knows that he didn't push me to all this questioning and doubt, and that I'm a victim of myself, which always defeated me and always pushed me to evil, to sin. Yes, dear Ihsan, I'm evil. I'm hooked on evil. So those are just the opening lines of I Do Not Sleep.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sharif, for reading that. So Jonathan, if you could then give us just so we know that this novel was serialized. So this is the first segment, the first thing that people are reading, and this, publication that they're maybe purchasing for other things too, right? So this is it's not like buying a dedicated novel. If you could just tell us a bit about how it appeared and how he worked. As you pointed out to me, each of these chapters is, pretty standard because it appears serialized.
Absolutely. And so it's easy to forget, but his real job was as a journalist and as an editor of the magazine. And so he spent all week, all day working on this magazine. And also during this time was when they were getting ready to launch another magazine that was called Sabah al-Khair. And here's an image of the very first one. And this magazine came out in January 1st, 1956. And so during this time, he was incredibly busy. And he had many acquaintances, many people would come through his office. And so he wrote multiple times about the way that it was very hard for him to find time to write fiction, and that writing fiction for him was a kind of escape. It was a kind of therapy. And he would typically write the fiction on Friday nights in his office. Once he had finished the deadlines and all the copy for Rosa Youssef, that's what he would go and write the fiction. And the thing that is, and write the installment for that week. And it was due the following morning. It was due very early the next morning. And so it's incredible to me as a scholar of modern Arabic fiction and of his work, that every chapter that he wrote was written in a few hours when he finally got some peace from the week in his office, hours before the deadline for the magazine. That doesn't mean that he didn't have a roadmap in his mind for what the novel was going to be and where the plot was going to go. But he did not work with drafts. He did not revise. He did not write the whole thing and then serialize it. He wrote week in and week out, Friday nights, stayed in the office until he finished, and then sent the magazine to the press, to the printer to be published.
That's just crazy to me, but I mean, because even Charles Dickens wrote in something of a similar manner, but not in this condensed like couple of hours. He must have at least been cogitating on it.
Absolutely, and deadlines are a powerful thing, right?
Right.
But it really is incredible. And so each chapter, of course, is part of it's serialized. That he wants people to come back for the next week, and so that's why his fiction has this feeling of each chapter ending with a kind of cliffhanger to get people to come the next week. And so that element of the serialization is very, very important, as is his language, as is the kind of quick, snappy, almost cinematic language. He was someone who worked very, very hard to try to popularize fiction and to use his magazine in a way to build audiences, not just for the media, but for fiction as well.
Right. So Sharif, I wanted to ask you, because in addition to being this massively popular novelist who's 50 of his books were turned into films, he was also a journalist, and in many ways working in the footsteps of his mother, Rosa Youssef, and who was also a sort of an entertainer and a journalist. And I wondered how you see your work as a journalist fitting into this sort of family business or family legacy.
Well, for one thing, I've been able to travel across the Arab world these last 10 years in my capacity as a journalist and covering stories. And I'm still amazed that wherever I go, Palestine, Yemen, Syria, Libya, people are fascinated to learn that I'm the grandson of Ihsan Abdel Quddus when they inquire about my name. It continues to happen here all the time at the airports when I arrive, or if I'm doing any official business and they see my full name, they ask if I'm related to the Ihsan. So it's incredible the breadth of this recognition that he retains, over 30 years after he died. But more importantly, the more I read about him and my great-grandmother, Rosa Yusuf, and how they both used their journalism as a way to challenge authority, as a way to instigate change, the more fascination I have for them. And I feel imbued with a sense of pride to be linked to both of them and to have that family lineage. My own identity in journalism was forged at Democracy Now!, which is an independent outlet based in New York, which has at the very core of its philosophy to be truly independent, to shun establishment orthodoxy, to speak truth to power, to give voice to the marginalized. And I've always tried to keep those principles in mind in my journalism. And when I read about my grandfather and my great-grandmother's lives and their work and how they so closely embodied those principles, it endlessly fascinates me, and in fact makes me feel closer to them. I'm nowhere near their stature or talent or impact, but it nevertheless makes me feel like I'm carrying something forward in the family legacy. And there's just so many stories and kind of historical episodes that I find incredibly compelling. One that I became a little obsessed with a few years ago and researched thoroughly, although I haven't written about it yet, is the case of Hussein Tawfiq. Hussein Tawfiq was this young, militant, anti-British nationalist who in 1946 assassinated Amin Osman, who was this very pro-British finance minister. So Hussein Tawfiq was arrested along with a few others implicated in the plot, including Anwar al-Sadat. And they were part of this very high-profile trial at the time. And Hussein Tawfiq somehow managed to escape from prison at some point, and the entire security apparatus in Egypt was looking for him, and the radio was blaring every half hour that there's a 5,000-pound bounty on his head, and also issuing threats that anyone who harbored him was an accomplice in a crime whose punishment was death. And it was then that my grandfather received a call late at night from a friend asking him to come immediately to meet him. And he got in his car and sped through the streets of Cairo at night and met him and found himself face to face with Hussein Tawfiq, this man that everyone was looking for. And whereupon he offered to hide Hussein Tawfiq in his house, an incredibly risky thing to do. He brought him back to his house on Qasr al-Aini Street with my grandmother. And there he hid and slept in my grandfather's bed for several days. And it was only when my grandmother thought that the cook had spotted Hussein Tawfiq in the bedroom somehow and was afraid they would expose them, that they called their revolutionary colleagues, and Hussein Tawfiq was taken to another hiding place. But this story formed the basis of my grandfather's novel, Fi Baytuna Rajul, There's a Man in Our House, that was later adapted into a film that's a classic of Egyptian cinema, starring Omar al-Sharif and Rushdie Abaza and Zubaydah Sarwat. So it's just fascinating. And the apartment on Qasr al-Aini Street, where all of this happened, was recently acquired again by our family, and I was able to visit it and see where this took place. And it's really imbued with this incredible history. And it's a history, I think, that resonates today with our collective experiences, especially with the 2011 revolution and all the moments of struggle and resistance and imprisonment and heroism that came with it. And of course, the defeat as well. And just very quickly, another kind of, sorry, I've gone on for a bit long, but another kind of nugget I found very striking, resonated with me as well as a journalist, was when my great-grandmother Rosa Yusuf handed over the reins of the magazine to her son Ihsan when he was just 26 years old. And he had been briefly imprisoned in August of 1945 for writing an article calling for the ouster of Lord Killearn, who was the British ambassador and basically the person in charge of the country at the time. And after he was released, Rosa Yusuf decided that Ihsan had passed through the experience that every chief editor at the magazine had passed through, which is prison. And so she handed over the reins to him. And in an October 1945 issue of the magazine, she publishes this note addressed from a mother to her son from one generation to the next. It's titled 20 Years of Waiting. And in it, she gives a number of points of advice. And it's just incredible. She tells him things like, reject arrogance in the face of fame, because arrogance is deadly. Always be curious and open to learning. Consider your conscience before your wallet, and fight oppression wherever you see it, and be with the weak against the strong, no matter the cost. So it's these episodes that I read about that are laden with so much meaning and resonance for me that I find so special.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of this letter appears in Ruth Cormack, who is here in this room today, in his Midnight in Cairo, and it's very moving transition between mother and son. So Jonathan, speaking of prison and publication and all these things, and Suzanne, if you could show the images during this next question. So I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the relationship between Ahsan's fiction, his journalism, and this, I don't know if we can call it activism, or his vision for the future of the country in general, and specifically when it came to this novel.
Absolutely. So Ahsan was intensely political. I mean, if you go back and look at his earliest editorials, starting in frankly the early 1940s, he's writing editorials that are really quite inflammatory, that are attacking the political elite for being corrupt, for calling for a wiping away of the old political guard that has corrupted the country, calling for revolution in ways that were really quite shocking at the time, and certainly got him in trouble in the way that Sharif is pointing to. And so his political activities were, in a sense, part and parcel with the magazine, and this activity didn't stop with the 1952 revolution. When he was deeply concerned about the direction of the country and the way that the country had moved away from democracy, which was why he had supported the free officers to begin with, why he had supported the coup and the revolution was to embed democracy in the country. In March 1954, he wrote a series of editorials that were incredibly inflammatory against the free officers and called for them to leave, basically to return to the barracks, and called for a real political process in the country. And he was jailed for that, in ways that were really quite different from the ways that he was jailed in the 1940s. This was a time in which he was, he was in jail for 3 months. He was in bad conditions. It was a terrible experience. And so when he left jail in the summer of 1954, this is really when his fiction changes dramatically. This is when he becomes the Ahsan that we know and love as a novelist. And so his fiction at this point really skyrockets, not just in the amount that he's writing, but the quality and the sensationalism of it. But unfortunately, up to this point, scholars and people who have appreciated his fiction just assumed that after he left jail, he stopped being political, that because he wasn't contesting the free officers in his editorials anymore in Rosa Yusuf, there's this idea that his fiction was detached from politics. And in the book that I'm finishing right now about Ahsan, I'm making the argument that nothing could be further from the truth, is that he used fiction as a way, a way that wasn't necessarily as direct and obvious as his editorials, but he used fiction in intensely political ways. And he said many times from the 1970s on, when I write editorials, I'm writing when I write editorials, I'm writing fiction. And when I write fiction, I'm writing politics. And for some reason, people didn't listen to that. That he's never been read in this way, that his fiction became his political contestation, became the way he challenged the state. And he had a particularly unique position that Gamal Abdel Nasser loved to read him and read him week in and week out. And there are times where it's obvious that he, at least to me, that he's writing to Gamal Abdel Nasser in this week's section, in this week's chapter, knowing that Gamal is reading him. Nasser did not read at least as far as we know, he wasn't someone who read books, but he loved the press. And Rosa Youssef was something that he read very, very closely. And so I just think that the way that, he didn't stop the being political, and he didn't stop the kind of political contestation that he did in the 1940s and early 1950s, just because he stopped doing that in his editorials. He did it in his fiction.
Right, and your suggestion is this particular novel is underneath the surface about the coup.
That's right. And so he returns to this basic theme again and again in one form or another. It's a kind of family drama of one form or another in which there's in which someone has accidentally embedded a traitor, embedded someone that is abusing the narrator or abusing the central female character. And this happens again and again in his fiction. It becomes a kind of obsession. It's like he's trying to tell the public that his unhappiness about the politics of Egypt in the 1950s and 60s through this metaphor of accidentally embedding a traitor into the fabric of the household and not being able to change that. This novel very strongly points to that and very strongly suggests the reading that it is a retelling of the 1940s, the colonialism, and a retelling of Ihsan's experience with the free officers before 1952, and a retelling of I think what haunted him, a sense of accidentally embedding Nasser in power.
Right, and thank you, Suzanne, for sharing these very racy images, some of which were published originally as it was serialized, and some of these are from the book. So Sherif, I wanted to ask you how you remember your grandfather and how you remember him being a part of the family and people talking about him and sort of the life around him as you were growing up.
Well, my grandfather, he died on January 11th, 1990. So today actually marks the 32nd anniversary of his passing. And I was 11 years old at the time. And I remember that it was the scale of the funeral that first made me really understand how prominent of a figure he was. I understood to a degree at the time that he was well known. But at the funeral, I remember they closed down Gabaleya Street in Zamalek in front of the building where he lived, which is the main thoroughfare. And I stood in the receiving line with my father, uncle, my cousin, and my older brother. And there were just hundreds and hundreds of mourners coming through and shaking our hands. And to my 11-year-old mind, that was something quite compelling to behold. And my uncle still lives in the same apartment. The family moved there in 1960 from that place in Asr Street. And since his death 32 years ago, hardly anything's changed in the apartment. It's like a museum. And so there is this sense of his legacy always there. His study where he wrote is as it was exactly with his desk. There's even still, the inkwell and the ink blotter and other items on the desk. There's this massive painting behind the chair where he sat that hangs, and it's of a man in a shirt being crucified. That's quite striking. And there's so much history in that room. There's the tin cup that he had in his cell when he was imprisoned by Nasser in 1954. There's photographs everywhere. There's an entire wall of books. It's really something. But my personal memories of him are fragmented, but some of them are indelible. I mean, I remember that in every room of the house, there was kind of his chair, his spot where he sat, and that no one else should sit there. I remember him going into his study and shutting the door, and we couldn't be loud near there, and he wouldn't emerge for a long time. I actually remember him once shouting from his study, asking my father for a French man's name, and my father yelled back, Pierre. And it must have been for one of his stories, but that's one of those strange memories that stuck. I remember being on our family plot in Monsureya and sitting in the garden with him and sometimes kicking a football around. He always had this kind of ubiquitous cigar that was always there, and he had this amazing large smile. And I also remember a little better, because it was when I was a little older, the period before he died. He had suffered a stroke in 1988, and he went to Virginia for a procedure in 1989 that went very badly, and he slipped into a coma. We visited him there in Virginia, and he came out of the coma, but after he came back, he was much frailer, and he appeared to have aged suddenly, very rapidly. And we were all on a Nile cruise at the end for New Year's in 1989, and I only very vaguely remember snapshots of this. But a couple of hours before midnight on New Year's Eve, he suffered a massive stroke and never regained consciousness. And I remember seeing him in hospital for the last time, hooked up to these machines, and he died on January 11th. But mostly I remember him being a loving grandfather, which is what he was to me and how I knew him. And it was only later that I began to understand and discover the incredible life that he led. And that process became very special to me when I embarked on my own career as a journalist.
Thank you so much. Jonathan, I wanted to ask you a little bit about why Nadia is sleepless. And I started to think about this a lot because of Hazem al-Wardani's Kitab al-Nawm, that also in this 2013 period puts sleep forward as such like an important state. So why is Nadia sleepless? What is this insomnia? What is this about?
Great. And also, I just wanted to go back to a second for the comments that I was making. I don't mean to take away from the fiction, the literary quality, the entertainment quality of the fiction. Even though I believe it is intensely political, what made him such a master writer was the way that, in a sense, he was able to hide that in a great plot, in a great storytelling, in great language that brought people back week in and week out for the next installment. But as far as the idea of sleeplessness, when I was doing the research for the book that I'm finishing about his life and career, I went back and read everything. I went and read everything. I read all of his editorials from this period, and I aligned them with the chapters. And when you do that, you have a very different view of the symbolism or what it is that he's trying to get across politically with each chapter, because these are intensely tied to the editorials that he's writing week in, week out in the kind of political events of the week or of the month. And so one of the things that was interesting was that in the time that he was preparing this, because he would write sometimes in the magazine and say, I'm preparing my latest novel, I've got the plot, you're going to see it soon. Right around this time, he writes an editorial about how he cannot sleep, about how he is suffering from insomnia. And that he tries again and again he tries a variety of different ways to sleep. He writes about how he would sit in the living room and listen to records, about how he would read the Quran, about how he would go into his son's room and snuggle with them in bed, but he could not sleep. And one of the things that was clear was that he was suffering from a sense of anxiety. And sometimes he wasn't very open about this, but in some ways he was most open about this by the characters in his novels. And so in this respect, Nadia in this text could be read as a first person or partly as a narration of Ihsan, of the anxieties that he was feeling, of the insomnia that he was feeling. He didn't talk about this too much, but he did admit that when he wrote I'm Free, which was the classic that was published in 1953, and has a female character, a female lead character, he did talk about how this was him, that he put himself in the novel as a female character. He never talked about the later novels in this way, but I think it was the start of a trend for him where, in a sense, the female characters in these texts represent a fusion of not just the own fictional, not just only the fictional character, but the things that he were on his mind and the things that he was grappling with. And so in that respect, he wrote a lot about fiction as therapy. The idea that fiction, of writing, of being by himself, of being lost in the fiction, was a kind of therapy for him. And it was the way that he found peace and the way that he was able to grapple with the things that were making him anxious. And so the text itself represents this. In other words, the novel is the product of an experience of self-therapy, I think, for him.
Hmm. So another thing I wanted another way in which it sort of leaps out of fiction into the world is that, I mean, Nadia Lotfi becomes a real person when a young woman named Paula renames herself Nadia Lotfi after the film character. And then there's the relationship between the book and the film. And you've said that people sort of sometimes misremember the book, giving it the not as depressing ending as this, not as troubling, you know, not as de-sleepifying as the end of the book.
And so, you know, as we mentioned in the beginning, some 50 classics of Egyptian cinema were based on his fiction of one form or another. I've got two of them, the posters behind me, the I Do Not Sleep, and then My Father's Up a Tree on the other side. But again and again and again in the 1950s and 60s, the endings of his novels that I think were intensely political got sanitized in the films, and they got transformed. They got, in a sense, almost transformed to the exact opposite of what the meaning, at least of the ending of the novels, basically, almost like the exact opposite. And so he wrote many times about how he hated watching his films, that he hated seeing what was done to them, that he felt that once he signed the contract, he had nothing to do with it. And this is the case, at least, you know, this is a classic of Egyptian cinema, but the ending of the film is totally different from the ending of the novel. At the end of the film, Nadia is punished for her treason. Nadia is, you know, punished for her plotting. She is burned, and you know, her dress catches fire at the end, and she confesses what she did to the father, and the father forgives her, and it's all happily ever after. I don't want to ruin the ending of the novel, but this is not how the novel ends.
Right, the novel is troubling. And leaves you in a troubled position. Sherif, I wanted to ask you which of your grandfather's novels you read first, and how you read it then, and how your understanding of his literary work has changed or not changed over the years.
Well, actually, growing up, my proficiency in reading Arabic was quite poor. This was the result of being schooled exclusively in English, and you know, Arabic kind of fell by the wayside. And this, of course, was, you know, a source of embarrassment for me in many ways for a long time, not only for the fact that I'm Egyptian and, you know, kind of all the colonial and neo-colonial complications that come with being that and unable to speak or properly access the language of one's motherland, but even more so because I'm the grandson of one of the most popular Arabic writers of the 20th century. And I was also a very avid reader of fiction growing up and remain so. And so this always felt like some kind of absence. But I remember when I was a boy, there was one translation of Ana Hurra, I Am Free, that did come out, and I read it then. But even then I could tell that it was a very poor translation. The English was not very good. However, since returning to Egypt over 10 years ago, and through my work as a journalist, I've made a concerted effort, and now my reading skills in Arabic are much better. And so actually one of the first books I read cover to cover in Arabic was Rosa Youssef's memoir. And reading is this amazing technology, right? That it allows through just some markings on a page for a person's voice to be in your head and the person speaks to you. So it was fascinating for the first time to have her voice in my head for the first time, my great grandmother. But the first book I read of my grandfather's was actually a series of articles that was compiled into a book in the 1980s. It's called على قهوة الشارع السياسي. على قهوة في الشارع السياسي. And it's basically structured as a conversation between an older man and a younger man sitting in an qahwa in a cafe speaking about politics. And this was the first book I read because I was very kind of hungry for his direct political views. I didn't want the metaphor at the time. This was, when the 2011 revolution was in full swing. And it was really intriguing to see how he was able to navigate back and forth between kind of the righteous and militant and revolutionary convictions of the young versus the more nuanced and yet safer political calculations of the old. So it was kind of very insightful. And I've read a couple of his shorter novels since, but actually the translation of La Anam, I Do Not Sleep, is the first time I kind of read him properly in English. And I have access to that in a different way in my brain. And it's opened some pathways for me to read him in a way and think about his writing. I mean, there's kind of a breathlessness to the prose that I can't kind of appreciate in the same way in Arabic. So I'm very grateful to Jonathan for translating this and AC Press for putting the book out. But actually, I wanted to ask Jonathan a question, if I could. His relationship with Abdel Nasser is something that endlessly kind of fascinates me. They're extremely close. He was kind of instrumental in the 1952 coup and called, to the barracks on the morning of the coup. And then, as we described, he's eventually jailed by him. And I wonder if you could just say that story of what happened between him and Abdel Nasser right after he came out. But also, when you came to visit here, you went to the Gamal Abdel Nasser Museum, which actually is right off Hussein Abdel Quddus Street. And in there, you saw Baytuna Rogul, one of his books, and in there he had endorsed to Abdel Nasser, and I forgot what he said, something, the great leader and a great friend or something. And this is the man who imprisoned him and, who you say is kind of this eternal source of guilt that he brought this traitor kind of into the house. So if you could just kind of talk about that complicated relationship between the two men.
I think they had an incredibly complicated relationship. I mean, just to give you a sense of this, when Hassan was jailed, when Nasser jailed him in the summer of 1954, when he got out, he went right home. And as soon as he got home, the phone rang. And he thought, oh, this must be my mother calling to check on me. And he picked up the phone and it was Nasser. And Nasser said to him, so Hassan, have you learned your lesson yet? And Hassan didn't know what to say. And then Nasser said, well, come to my house right now and we'll talk. And so instead of having the opportunity to spend time with his family, he had to go to Nasser's house. And this was an entire month where he had to go every day for lunch and to watch a movie. Nasser was of course a great lover of cinema, and they would project a movie on his tennis court. And so he was forced to sit and have lunch with Nasser for an entire month. And after a month, he said to Nasser, "Why are you doing this? Why are you inviting me here every day?" And Nasser said to him, "Because I'm giving you incredibly rich." One of the things that's a challenge about Nasser is that I have so much written, don't have much written that he wrote about people. And so in a sense, Nasser is a collage. He's a collage interacted with him. But what we do know is that Nasser humiliated people. And he found that this was a kind of a part of his political modus operandi. And so what was clear was that he was intentionally trying to insult and humiliate Ihsan. is in a sense a message directly to Nasser through the fiction that you're not going to insult me, you're not going to humiliate me. I'm going to do what I can in this fiction in order to tell what I had to say, what I have to say, in order to be the same person that I am. And again, he comes back to contest Nasser in the fiction in ways that weren't widely known, because his experience with the free officers was not widely known in Egypt. And his role in the buildup to the coup was also not widely known. And so in many ways, it seems like he's writing for himself, but he's also writing directly for Nasser. And it's clear that Nasser would have been able to read right through the symbolism and the metaphor. And we know that Nasser read him closely, and he got in trouble for a wonderful novel called Girls in the Summer that was translated, one of the sections was translated magnificently in Banipal recently. He got in, Nasser basically, he thought he was going to be jailed for this again, and he had to find his way back into Nasser's good graces. There's a letter that he wrote to Nasser to try to prevent another jailing. This similar thing happened in 1964 when he published his magnificent novel A Nose and Three Eyes, which is the next novel that AUC will be publishing in translation. And Ihsan has the honor of being the first novelist brought before Parliament for harming public morality, and was interrogated by the police for that novel as well. So I hope I'm answering your question, but it was a relationship that is not, that is, I think, recorded in the fiction and is it continues. It's not something that is just easily set and easily. It's something that is not resolved. If only we had Nasser's memoirs.
Or Ihsan's memoirs as well, although you say his memoirs are everywhere. He
said again and again in the 70s and 80s in interviews that he gave, there's no point in me writing memoirs. It's all in my fiction.
So I'm going to shift to some of the questions that we have and let people know that they can continue to add questions as we're talking. Apparently somebody on Facebook wanted to know, I'd be curious to know if he would have been friends with Naguib Mahfouz.
He was. They grew up in the same area. They both grew up in Abbasiyah, and they were friends. They were childhood friends, where they knew each other as kids, but they were very, very close. Close in the 1950s. Naguib Mahfouz wrote the screenplays for some of Ihsan's films, and they stayed in very close, close contact, certainly, for literary and journalistic circles throughout their lives. There's a wonderful, wonderful video of Ihsan coming to congratulate Naguib Mahfouz in 1988 for the Nobel Prize, and it is just a delightful video in how heartfelt the congratulations is.
But you said that Ihsan also sort of mocked Naguib Mahfouz gently for his more literary language of his novels.
Absolutely. Right? So Ihsan is an inheritor of the Nahda, of the 19th century Renaissance, of a simplification of the language, of the expansion of literacy, of disseminating Arabic on the broadest possible, a readership on the broadest possible level. And so he purposely simplified his language and in a sense sensationalized his language, which is why he's such a good writer to read for teaching advanced Arabic. And that's really how I discovered him. I had the best teacher of Arabic, Farouk Mustafa at the University of Chicago long ago. And I learned to read Arabic by reading Ihsan's stories. And that's how I learned. And it was Farouk who was long ago an impetus for this translation and this work.
Excellent. So the next question is, I believe from Walid, is why translate La Anam into English first as opposed to any of his other novels? For example, I'm Free, Thanks.
So I think I'm Free is an incredibly important classic of feminist literature and should absolutely be translated. But there was a period where I read everything, all of the fiction from the 50s and 60s, very, in quick succession. And I just felt that I Do Not Sleep really was the one to start with, because it's a great story. It's a page turner, and it's from this period where he really begins to generate these classics. And you don't need to have any background in Egyptian history. The text is intensely political, but you can read it without knowing anything about the 50s and 60s, about Nasser, about this period. And so I thought the novel was just a great read, a great work of literature, but also had this amazing political subtext that people who do have this background could understand.
I just want to say that Kay says that Farouk thanks you. So Fatin Morsi also asked, also for you, Jonathan, sorry. Can you talk to us about some of the challenges in translating the text from Arabic to English?
So I want to hide as a translator. I want to do everything I can to duplicate the experience of reading the novelist as if you were reading him in Arabic. Now, of course, that's impossible in English, but I just work as hard as possible to make the text not read like a translation and reflect the style, the language choices that the author would have made themselves. And I do the best I can. It's a very hard process.
Excellent. So I know we're sort of coming to the end of our time. I wanted to ask Jonathan about, and both of you, Jonathan and Sharif, about what is Ihsan's legacy, both his literary legacy and his legacy in journalism. Who did he pass the torch to? What does he bring to, how does he continue to live on now? Either one of you.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay.
I mean, for me, I kind of kept discovering more and more the richness of his experience and how committed he was to kind of principles that guided him for most of his life, for his entire life, really. And for me, I think that the legacy lives, the torch is passed not just to, if we think beyond kind of national boundaries, this torch is passed to kind of all journalists and all kind of writers who want to challenge status quos and want to challenge orthodoxy and want to never fall within kind of established frameworks. And for me, that's endlessly inspiring. And to be, also just, I don't understand how he wrote that much. And you have to remember, this is also with a pen and paper. We even have computers now, it makes it so much easier, but the amount of output is really quite staggering. And it always compels me when I'm sitting down and watching a YouTube video or something that's, no, we should be writing. And so I think, his legacy as a journalist is kind of the legacy of what journalism should be in many ways, which is to kind of challenge authority and to, as his mother advised him, to stand with the weak against the strong.
And as far as, from my perspective, we could talk about his legacy as a writer. And one reason why we haven't seen him translated into English up to this point, or at least in a way that is widely accessible, is that he was a populist. He was someone who wrote popular fiction. And this is something that's been, frankly, ignored by scholars of literature, scholars of Arabic, or people who haven't taken him seriously as a writer. And so in that respect, I see him as the father of Egyptian popular fiction today. I was honored to be good friends with Ahmed Khaled Tawfiq, who passed away, of course, and he is the kind of godfather of Egyptian horror fiction. But when I talked with him about this project, he was so enthusiastic, and he would say things like, if you want to understand, Arabic popular fiction, he is the one who needs, who has to have this book written about him. And right now, if you go to any bookstore in Cairo, you're going to see tons and tons and tons of popular fiction. That is, fiction, can be read and enjoyed for enjoyment, for entertainment, and he is the father of that.
And if you go to see illegal downloads on 4Shared, you'll find that Hussein is still up at the top. So I thank you guys both for your time. I think it's been a wonderful hour that we've spent discussing Hussein and this novel. I really appreciate your time and appreciate AUC Press for finally bringing this out in English.
Well, thank you so much, Marcia, for moderating this. You did a wonderful job, and I'm sure everyone who joined us enjoyed it as much as I did. So interesting to hear about the background story, about the history that is not easily found or told, but also the novel is very exciting to read. And we're so proud to be publishing the English translation, and hopefully we'll do more and more of these, as Jonathan said. And you can buy your copy of I Do Not Sleep electronically. You can find it online. You can buy it from online book retailers or major bookstores worldwide. And please let us know your reviews when you find them on the different online stores. Thank you, Sharif, and thank you, Johnson. Of course, again, thank you, Marcia, so much for your time. And thanks for everyone who joined us from all over the world. The recording of this event, you can find it afterwards on our Facebook channel and YouTube channel as well. Thank you, and
thank you all.
Have a beautiful evening or day, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.